Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matthew Bay. I am a senior analyst here at Rain, and with me today is one of our Asia Pacific analysts and one who focuses on quite a bit on North and South Korea, Scott Cartus. Scott, how are you doing?
Good. How you doing, Matthew?
Yeah, so Scott, I know that the two of us, we've been working very closely on kind of scenario planning around North Korea and some of its missile activity and things like that. But it's becoming timely as we are seeing right now, an intensification of tests that North Korea has done in recent days. Can you just walk us through kind of what we've seen over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah. So we've seen your standard North Korean missile tests, and when I say standard, we kind of have to lay out a few things here. A lot of North Korean missile tests, instead of going far out, they go very high up and short distance, but very high altitude. That's because they
Yeah.
try to typically avoid flying over Japan. The
Well, they're
most
also ballistic
recent
missiles. Ballistic missiles need to go into the
Yeah,
atmosphere.
they definitely do. But there is something to be said about shooting a missile over your neighbor. Nobody really likes that. It's not, the nicest thing to do. And obviously, the most recent test we saw, North Korea did shoot a missile over Japan. Now, this to also be very clear, I know a lot of people online were looking at this and thinking, the missile's flying over Tokyo. It's not. This thing was 1,000 kilometers in altitude. It was about
And just for
620
context,
some odd
1,000
miles.
kilometers, that's basically as high as the International Space Station, or actually higher.
Yeah.
So it's not. So I guess the distinction here is that they were flying a ballistic missile as opposed to a cruise missile. A cruise missile will be
Hmm.
close to the surface. So we've only
Yeah.
seen ballistic missiles recently, right?
Yes, but we've only seen ballistic missiles, short and medium range ballistic missiles, or intermediate range ballistic missiles. Now, when we got also to keep in mind too, these medium or intermediate range ballistic missiles still reach a pretty far distance. These aren't like just some short 500-mile missiles. These are very, very, very long
What
distance
is
missiles.
the range, like the maximum range of some of the recent ones that we've seen?
The most recent one went about 4,600 kilometers, which is 2,800 ish miles. And it went over Japan, but again, it went over a far less populated area of Japan on the northern part. So North Korea is not trying to fly directly over Tokyo. They're not trying to send a message like that.
Yeah,
Their
and I
missiles can hit
think what
anywhere.
illustrates that point is you just think about here in the United States, if we want to test a missile and we do it all the time, we have gigantic area. We can fly it over the Pacific Ocean, not really going to go anywhere. We can fly it over the Atlantic Ocean, not really going anywhere. Just you look at the map, North Korea is a very small country. No matter where they launch it in any direction, it's going to fly over somebody else's territory, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's what, like, the last time they did some of these flyovers was 2017. Again, they flew over Japan. It does cause concern. And I know, like, a lot of the media made it out like, oh my gosh, the air raid sirens are happening. But most people in Japan are like, what? Like, can't see it. It's really high up. So yeah, like, they are testing a lot of missiles, and they do test their missiles for their own purposes. They're not testing. I know, and I like to dispel this myth a lot. They're not testing these missiles to suddenly get some food concessions from South Korea or the West. They're not doing that. They're doing these missiles because they need to test their systems. Like you said, the United States tests their missiles. You need to have a missile system. You need to test it. If you don't, how do you know it's going to work? And we're seeing that kind of problem with Russia and Ukraine, and that's a whole different story. But if you're not testing your missiles, you don't know how reliable they are.
Um, so I guess I agree that there's probably at the same time a lot of technical reasons as to why they're testing them, but the immediate back-to-back succession that we've seen, is there any though political motivation? Not so much in the sense of trying to get more concessions, but is there at least timing that we needed to think about? I know that a lot of people right now are expecting another nuclear test sometime in the next, I guess, imminently or the next couple of weeks, something around there. Is there anything to the timeline, even if it really isn't purely politically motivated?
Yeah, the United States was just conducting these trilateral and bilateral naval exercises with the USS Ronald Reagan. That was in the waters between Japan and South Korea. So these missile tests could be kind of a response to that, saying, "Hey, we see your missile test, or we see your naval test, and here's some missile tests." Just kind of a almost tit for tat sort of thing. You also have North Korea probably doesn't want to be conducting these missile tests in the middle of the upcoming Party Congress in China, which is taking place in a few weeks in October in Beijing, I believe. So because North Korea knows that this grabs headlines, they still do this with at least some tacit acknowledgement of Beijing. So they're not going to want to steal Beijing's thunder on the international stage when that's something Beijing really wants everyone to be aware of, and it's kind of their week, so they don't want anyone to steal that thunder. So it could be some of that. It could be just maybe some issues with Japan. There are some, obviously we see some recent discussions with Japan and South Korea. Maybe it's saying, hey, we'll fly a missile over your head, Japan. Just remember, we're still looking at you. But there's a number of things it could be, but I still think it's heavily driven by just their internal.
Yeah, I mean, from just an engineering and a standpoint, that makes perfect sense. I do have a question though that I think is an interesting one. I believe this is the first barrage of these not attacks, I guess, of the tests. Sorry, my brain's been thinking about a different conflict right now. But it's the first one that we've seen, I think, under the new administration when it took over, I believe, in May. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I want to say he took over in May off the top of my head. He's been in office just 3.
So have we seen any different reaction from South Korea to the barrage than we normally would see?
Yes and no. Under the previous administration, Moon Jae-in, he was a more liberal. He was in the Liberal Party, so he didn't really respond typically to any North Korean I put this in quotes, provocations. Although before he left office, he did respond to some North Korean missile tests with their own fighter drills. South Korea launched a few of their rockets and missiles into the sea. Could demonstrate that South Korea is like, we also have capabilities. And to demonstrate specifically South Korea's decapitation strategy, they have a strategy because they don't have nuclear weapons to, have precision airstrikes or rocket strikes or missile strikes to kill high-ranking North Korean officials to effectively destroy their command structure.
Well, I mean, the U.S. in that kind of scenario would respond on their behalf, though, right?
Yeah, well, it's supposed to. So hopefully we don't reach that stage. Let's be honest here. But then you do have then when Moon left, then you had Yoon come in, and Yoon did respond. I should say the Yoon's administration and the South Korean military and U.S. responded with their own missile tests. They launched 4 ATACMS into the waters. These are just kind of long-range rocket artilleries. And South Korea did launch their own homegrown Hyunmoo-2 rocket, which actually blew up shortly after launch. And to be very clear on that, South Korean authorities do not think it's sabotage. They don't think it was, malicious actors. It seems to be just an error that was in the flight pattern or launching or whatever it was. Details haven't come out.
Missiles, especially when they're newly developed, they always, in any kind of a rocket system, there's always a high risk of failure. So that's to be expected, to be honest. Just anybody who's watching, if you do have any questions, please send them our way. We'll make sure that Scott's ready to answer those. Another thing in terms of the reaction, how has the U.S. reacted in terms of both? Are we talking about new sanctions, anything like that that's been proposed?
Yeah, the United States issued 3 sanctions against 3 different companies. One company is registered in Singapore, one company is registered in Taiwan, and another company is registered in the Marshall Islands. These are shipping companies that supposedly engaged in ship-to-ship transfers with North Korean vessels as a means to evade sanctions. As we know, North Korea is like the most heavily sanctioned nation on the planet. Pretty much you just can't do most business with them. And to be kind of clear too, sanctioning these 3 companies, in my opinion, won't really do anything.
Yeah, it's not even really a sanctions thing. It's more of an enforcement action as opposed to, tougher, more sanctions. Because as you say, what can the U.S. do? What's not sanctioned, obviously, of course.
Yeah, so a lot of times they're not even sanctioned, like, let's say, North Korean company. They'll sanction, like, a Chinese individual businessman who they say helped fund the weapons programs. A lot of these sanctions have to be unilateral because China and Russia recently in the UN Security Council have been voting against any UN Security Council sanctions or resolutions against North Korea. So the U.S. is responding like that.
Yeah, and as I go around the map, I guess the one country I really haven't talked about in terms of how they're responding is China. Obviously, China has a very close relationship with the Kim government. Not something like a control relationship or anything like that, of course. But given some of the criticism that, not really open criticism, I guess would be the way to frame it, but some of the, should I say, not supportive comments that some Chinese officials have made against some of the stuff that Russia has been doing in Ukraine recently, it seems like China would want to urge restraint when it comes to what North Korea is doing right now. Is that kind of what you anticipate, or do you have a different opinion?
It's interesting because, like you said, China doesn't control North Korea. I know, again, a lot of people, you see on social media, places like Reddit are always like, no, Xi Jinping controls Kim Jong-un. That's not really the case. They do influence, North Korea is very heavily dependent on China, but China is also not about to just let North Korea collapse. That'd be worse. So I don't know if China's necessarily going to urge restraint in their weapons development program. If anything, they just still want it to go, just don't go wild with it. Keep a focused development. Don't just throw missiles off willy-nilly, and obviously don't do it during our party Congress.
Yeah, and maybe don't test the nuke, especially as Putin is threatening nukes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually intrigued by that because like you mentioned earlier, the South Korean National Intelligence Service briefed not the White House, the Blue House, the South Korean, well, no longer the Blue House. Sorry, the South Korean presidency and Yoon administration was briefed saying that they believe there will be nuclear tests between October 16th and November 7th. It's a pretty specific time frame. It's just before the U.S. midterm elections, and it starts right around the Chinese Party Congress. So I don't think the National Intelligence Service would say this without having a very, very, very good idea that this is happening. And also, North Korea wouldn't be, if you're going to prepare for nuclear tests, there's a lot of precursors, a lot of indicators that you do. And North Korea's been having these for the past year. They've been fixing up the Punggye nuclear test site, which is this mountain that they test underground. They've been fixing up those tunnels. There's been activity at the nuclear reactor there to spin up more fissile material. So we've been seeing this for the past year, and North Korea isn't in the position where they could just waste time, energy, and effort on having this big fake out. Like, if you're going to do a nuclear test as North Korea, like, you're going to do it. You're not just going to prepare, go all the way, and then be like, psych, guys, April Fools. So I have a feeling North Korea is still going to conduct their nuclear test. I don't think China is really going to be upset at it as long as it doesn't go catastrophically wrong and it doesn't take place when China doesn't want it to happen. Matthew, I think you're muted right now.
I am. Thank you. The next thing I wanted to ask about was what is the status of diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea? I mean, it seems to me on my end that it's been basically dormant since President Trump left office. And to be clear, the last couple of years of President Trump, since he went and visited and stepped over into North Korea by like a foot. But what is the status of that? Do we have any possible pathways to go back to that, especially under the Biden administration, or is that just not really realistic?
For the most part, the United States administration, I don't think, is going to try and take a lead on negotiations, partly because the U.S. is just too distracted. Look at Taiwan, look at China, look at Ukraine, Europe, and everything else with that. Look at the domestic problems in the United States. We have inflation, we have all these other problems, Fed hiking rates. So there's a lot of stuff that the Biden administration is more concerned about, in my opinion. And I believe I don't think we're going to see change. I think especially South Koreans don't want the United States to lead any negotiations. So the Yoon administration and South Koreans in general are going to be like, no, we'll lead this. You just back us up. And for the most part, I think the United States will. I don't think the U.S. is going to say, well, we don't agree with that. Well, we're going to withdraw our support. No, South Korea, they have their own desires, and Yoon is harsher on North Korea, but he's not refusing to speak to Kim Jong-un. So.
Yeah, and I don't think right now, the U.S. is focused on other things. It doesn't seem like the U.S. has as strong of an interest as it once did on the denuclearization aspect in North Korea. Although I guess the open question is if we do have another test and say that's followed up by another test next year, do the quick succession of that put it back into the United States focus as a major issue? Although I still think, their hands are going to be somewhat tied because there's an active war in Ukraine that could actually become a nuclear conflict. But I'm just wondering if an actual test doesn't change the U.S.'s perception on what they would need to do relative to North Korea.
Yeah, it also heavily depends on what type of nuclear test is conducted. Your standard nuclear test, which is, hey, we have a nuclear bomb or a nuclear missile, whatever. Okay. But if you miniaturize the warhead and are able to put it on some of these long-range ballistic missiles, now you threaten the United States mainland, continental U.S. with an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, that has a nuclear warhead. Suddenly you're actually threatening the U.S. That could change some things, but I don't think the U.S. is fundamentally going to be able to change their policies towards North Korea. In my opinion, the concept of denuclearization in North Korea is such a far-gone conclusion, but to so many American politicians, you have to keep saying it you've painted yourself into a policy corner where you have to keep saying it, even though there's literally no chance that North Korea is going to give up their nukes. They
Yeah, but
just passed a law.
you go back to 2016, I guess 2016 to I guess 2017, 2018 though. There was a lot of significant concern that we could actually have conflict breaking out. I know, like U.S. military was looking at various operations they could be doing in the event of a conflict on the peninsula. We had a lot of clients asking us, well, what do I need to plan for in terms of the contingency? What could happen to Seoul? What could happen to Busan? What could happen to some of the port infrastructure in South Korea? And also, how does it affect other places? Um, Even if we don't anticipate, an escalation or a nuclear strike or something like that on the U.S., of course, it might be something that a lot of companies will be asking themselves again if we get to a pathway where there is more escalation, even in the rhetoric, because of these tests. If we, that lull that was under, the part of the Trump administration is going to be gone, once the second that happens, basically. So given that nowadays a lot of organizations are very intense on geopolitical risks, they looked at, well, Ukraine actually became a conflict. A lot of people, as you are well aware of, have been asking us about Taiwan. Will they be asking us again about North Korea? And it might be because their fears are overblown or whatever the reasons may be. When you compare it to these other three conflict theaters, especially I guess Taiwan, because that's not the one that's not an active war. Which one do you think is actually a bigger risk for companies that say are exposed to both South Korea? Say they have a plant that's in Seoul or Busan or some other city, but they also have operations in New Taipei. Which one should they be more concerned about? As a going forward.
My gut would say to be more concerned about Taiwan. I think there's a lot of reasons why. North Korea, for all of their bluster, the regime is interested in regime stability and continuity. The Kim family, Kim Jong-un, Kim Yo-jong, him and his sister, they don't want to start a war because they recognize a war that they start, China may not necessarily back them up. And if it was just a war between only South Korea and only North Korea, no one else getting involved, kind of...
It's not realistic, though.
Well, like I said, there's a lot of ifs in that. It's not realistic because they attack South Korea. You have 28,500 United States troops stationed in South Korea in various bases. I think Camp Humphreys is still there, Camp Stanley maybe. They're down in Pyeongtaek now. They're moving out of the Itaewon area base. Sorry, that's right. I used to live near the Itaewon base, so it was, or Yongsan base, I should say, the Itaewon area. Now they're in Pyeongtaek, south of Seoul. At any rate, you have these soldiers, and they're going to be drawn into the conflict. That's why they're there. And so North Korea recognizes this, and I think it is extremely unlikely for North Korea to take a step to conduct an offensive attack, because that would result in, everyone saying, well, North Korea, now we have to fight you. And China, that I'm pretty sure China would not be okay with. China doesn't want North Korea to start anything.
Yeah, so, and I think go.
Oh, go on. Yeah.
Honestly, I think what's the difference between, I think we both agree that a conflict in Taiwan and a conflict on the Korean Peninsula are both very unlikely scenarios, at least for the next a few years. What I think is very different about the two operating environments is that in Korea, while yes, you face some level of cyber risk from Lazarus Group and other cyber actors and things like that, it's not the same degree of the short of conflict options that China has against Taiwan that North Korea has against South Korea. For example, what we saw right after Speaker Pelosi's visit was basically a soft blockade where China was doing a bunch of military actions, like, just off the coast outside of territorial waters that Taiwan claims of a lot of the ports, so that's kind of like raising shipping costs. North Korea really doesn't have those kinds of options to the same degree that aren't, actual hard power, like, occasional border shelling that we used to see, things like that. So I think it's these other short of war risks that make Taiwan a lot more complicated for companies than South Korea. And that's what I think, if we are in the future going to be getting questions asking about the comparison or the risks to North Korea, there really isn't that big of a delta between now and the risky, or sorry, there isn't a lot in between of what could happen that isn't already happening in terms of what is the pathway to conflict with North Korea and South Korea. It's no, you're in a war, or the risk is more or less what it is now. Whereas there's a lot bigger of a gradient when it comes to short of conflict actions in Taiwan.
Yeah. And in my opinion too, like the situation between Taiwan and North Korea is still slightly different. Yes, South Korea and North Korea are still technically at war. They didn't sign the ceasefire, but for the most part, like, everyone's kind of just accepted the current status quo. China has never said that they were going to give up Taiwan. And the way I look at it is China still considers it to be a domestic issue. Taiwan has lost a few supporters in the international community. North Korea doesn't really have that many, but you know,
We've got Russia
but
and China.
yeah, they got Russia, China. But in general, like the situation is just slightly different. I think the international community is obviously very concerned about innovation in Taiwan because they have a lot of, you know, trade these chips, chipsets. Obviously, their trade with China is a big problem, so everyone's worried about this. You can't lose one of your biggest trading partners. No one has a trading with North Korea, really. But again, it's just the situation is North Korea is not likely to conduct an offensive action because they just can't. China is more likely. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying they're more likely than North Korea, which isn't saying much necessarily.
Yeah. So Scott, I know we've been speaking for about 20 minutes now. Did you have anything else that you wanted to hit? I know we've hit quite a bit, honestly.
No, I mean, I just think because I think it's funny because I watch social media a lot and I see a lot of discussions about North Korea and I kind of laugh at how very wrong they really are. So I have to refrain from commenting. But I think we're going to watch this upcoming North Korean supposed nuclear test. We're going to see what happens with it. What does it mean? Do they have a miniaturized warhead? Do they just have a standard nuclear test? Do they conduct a nuclear test? Maybe the spy agency is wrong. I highly doubt that. But
or maybe they just delay it until after. It seems to me like the more likely timing would be after the stuff in China, so it'll be closer to, I guess, late or early November. Just my 2 cents.
I was thinking it's definitely going to be after the Party Congress, but before the U.S. midterm elections, because North Korea is very aware of the international community. They're not cut off. They know what's going on in the world. At least the leadership does. So they would use something like this to see if they can mess with elections. However, it could. I don't really know how the Biden administration will respond. Really, I'll be intrigued to see how they will respond.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens.
And I don't think American voters will be responding that much, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's just like if the Biden administration says, "Oh no, we're fine. Yeah, Kim Jong Un, be friends," that would lose a lot of votes. But other than that,
no, we'll send Dennis Rodman. It'll be fine. With that, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Scott, for joining as well. If you'd like to have more of our analysis or see what Scott and I are producing on various topics, please visit rainnetwork.com. That is RANE network.com. So it's not Rain, RAIN, it's Rain, RANE. Thank you.
Thank you.